All right, I think we can go ahead and get rolling. How's everybody doing? Good. Okay. You all are pretty energetic. Cool. Everybody having a good MAGFest so far? I've been in some incredible shows. Did anybody see the Rebecca Sugar showcase yesterday? That was fantastic. I cried. Did not expect Estelle to show up. She was so great. The energy's been really great this MAGFest, and I appreciate y'all showing up. So really, I created this panel with a very specific purpose in mind. I was sitting at a table playing in a tabletop role-playing game of my choice. It was D&D 5e 2024 rules, which I think it's an interesting modification of the rule set. But I had a feeling that when we were all sitting at the table, we all were experienced players with an experienced GM. But it felt like whenever a role play session was initiated, whenever it was clear that the GM was introducing an element that was tied to one of our backstories, that the GM was really just speaking with that one player, right? And that's cool. It's really interesting and important, I think, for the GM to take into consideration the elements that players want to have in their backstories. But it would be more interesting and more collaborative if we all as players could be more comfortable with knowing when to break that kind of one-on-one interaction and when to jump in and create as players, right? Collaborative creation, for me personally, is one of the aspects of D&D that I find most interesting. Cool. So if y'all are cool with that, I'd like to just take you through some of the examples of what might be constructive in collaborative storytelling, collaborative improv, and what might be a little bit disruptive. So a little bit about me. My name is Justin. I'm from Richmond, Virginia. I also I spent a good amount of time here in the DC area. I've been presenting at MAGFest for a number of years. I've also presented at AwesomeCon, Epic Quest, and a few others. If you are a Virginia local, there's an event called Berg Quest that I highly, highly recommend. That is a tabletop-centric event in Williamsburg, Virginia. It's in the fall, like usually late September, early October. Highly recommend that. I've given a few similar talks here at BergQuest as well. A lot of the examples I'm going to be drawing from will probably use D&D as a frame of reference, but really this is not specific to any one rule set. So if anybody is a Call of Cthulhu player, a Mothership player, a Dungeon World, PBTA kind of player, then this is something that can very easily translate into those systems. And in fact, I'll draw from some examples of how those other systems use bonds as a way to connect player characters in a more organic way on the character sheet. That is a picture of me doing very much like a closet Nanami cosplay. If you were here yesterday, was anybody here in the space yesterday for the celebrity match game? It was very fun. I was a closet Robert Dispatch for that, so that was a fun kind of time. Cool. So really, what I'm trying to address here is when you're playing in a TTRPG session, it can be difficult to establish connections between you and the other players at the table. Really what we're trying to do here is to have a discussion about encouraging ways that we can be more collaborative with other players at the table in role play in a way that does not trample on them, right? Because that's a terrible feeling when you feel like you're inserting yourself into kind of that exchange of ideas and maybe you're not getting that nice back and forth energy that we want. And what we really want to avoid at all costs here is a situation where you feel like you're shutting down that creative exchange of energy between other players and between players and the GM. Cool. So the crux of this argument, how can players encourage one another to role play as their characters and to collaborate on character backstories? I'll stop here and ask, has anyone really experienced a situation at a during a tabletop role playing session where they felt like they could not engage other players in role playing. Cool. I'll start over here.
I'm a DM, and a year or so ago, I had a really kind of toxic person in my group where they didn't engage with anybody except for their partner, and it was basically just like a them show.
Okay. Okay, to summarize, as the DM, how do you engage with the person who wants to make this all about them and has trouble engaging with other people at the table?
When I would try and like do one-on-one work with like a different player, they just shut down, had nothing to do with it. Whereas
Yeah.
my other players were actually trying really hard to.
Yeah.
There was just like two games going on.
Yeah, yeah, that can be hard when players. So when players aren't, if you're the GM, if players aren't, and I use GM, DM, whatever, interchangeably. If players aren't responsive to your attempts to bring them into role play, how do you bring that up? Okay, cool. Any other thoughts? We had a few other hands. Cool. I'll go over there.
I've been playing with a same group for like 5 years now, and one of the members, he is not very great at taking the proverbial bait when it comes to LP. And on top of that, when he does take the bait, he tends to treat it like just a standard conversation, not really with a yes and type deal.
Okay.
And he just has a hard time connecting with the rest of the party.
Okay, that's an interesting point. So recognizing when someone maybe does not have the experience in improvisation, role play, whatever you want to call it, to recognize when they're being teed up to create something. Okay, that's fair. And let me ask this before I get to some of your other points. What does yes and mean to you?
Yes and to me, it's the core concept of yes and is, if someone ends up if you do like some RP between two characters,
Mm-hmm.
and let's say character one brings up like, oh, when I was a child,
Yeah.
the yes and in that scenario wouldn't be like, oh, okay. It would be like, oh, what was that like?
Yeah.
Giving each other a chance to expound on their backstory, because if these characters know about each other, it's easier to tell the story.
Yeah, yeah. So when players recognize that they're being given the opportunity to expand more, and the ball is being passed to them, that's a metaphor that I like. When you recognize that you, as the GM or as another player, are passing the ball to someone else at the table to then create something. Cool. Okay. Anybody else comments on like blockers to role playing at the table before we get started? I'll go over here.
I think my party tends to tunnel vision through battle. So
Mm,
they just want to get to the next combat,
okay.
and then it's hard to find the moment in between to actually start banter. And if I do try to start banter, maybe I lean more chaotic, and that like goes against someone else's alignment.
Okay.
And it's kind of like, how do I start that before I banter?
Okay. Yeah. So how do we transition from that kind of grindy combat mindset into, an opportunity for the players to interact with one another in character outside of combat? Is that fair? Cool. Okay. Anybody else? I'll go up here in the front.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, kind of similar to that. I'm a first time DM, and for me, my issue is just my players kind of treat it as like a video game. Like there's a scripted
Mm-hmm.
set of when I really want them to like, or they don't act like they're characters. Like they don't really, I don't think they really define their characters, and I really want them to do that. Like play your character.
Yeah.
Not kind of tough.
Yeah, yeah, it can be difficult to get someone in the mindset of, here is on paper the character sheet doesn't just have mechanics on it, right? It has so much more on it. It has an opportunity for you to expound upon your backstory, your motivation, and getting players to kind of connect to that in a way that goes beyond just, hey, here's what I can do mechanically.
Yeah, they treat every situation like it's just like video games. Like
Hmm.
here's the quest, or here's the thing, we're gonna go do that.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
Instead of being like, well, my character doesn't agree with what
Okay.
this guy stole from me, or like I want to get more money, so I'm going to try to cheat him out of it.
Yeah, yeah, and that's an interesting point I want to address as well. Like knowing part of this idea of like passing the ball back and forth is knowing when you have to move the action forward, even if in character you don't necessarily agree with what's happening. That's another difficult line to walk, right? Like my character maybe has reservations about what we're doing, but I recognize that the DM has prepared something for us, right? So I'm going to engage in that content, even if I have reservations about it. Is that okay? Cool. So we anybody else? I want to make sure I'm addressing. Sure, I'll go there in the back. Okay. Yeah, yes, yeah. So what giving life to NPCs and player characters, right? Instead of just making them quest givers, how do we maybe more fully realize them as individuals to interact with? Is that fair? Okay, cool. And I think we had one more in the up here in the flannel. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, just from experience as a player and a GM, it can really difficult to get players to talk to each other because
Yeah.
I think in a lot of systems, your character is the sort of set of mechanics that appears
Yep.
solving the problem in front of you, and usually that problem is the DM, whatever the GM is supposed to do.
Yeah.
So there's a tendency for players to fall back on this, oh, who has the highest charisma score? We'll talk to the DM. And
Hmm.
it's hard to force, because
Yeah.
you can have out-of-game conversations with players, here's the, here's the social dynamic, here's the safety dynamic.
Yeah.
You can't really force people to say, okay, go do organic character mechanics.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's another that goes in hand with the idea of like teeing someone up, passing them the ball, like and helping them realize when they've been passed the ball to do some role playing. Okay, cool. And I think we had one more. Yeah,
Something I struggle with as a player is that here's the people I play with who are fantastic and I love playing with anything, but I feel like I don't have as much time or energy outside of the games in it to like developing my character backstory as they do the way that they fit into the world. So it feels like they all have a place in the world and that sometimes I'm just a guy that's there.
okay.
And how do I kind of get better at coming up with ways to be more involved and understanding something else that I'm sure people will be very helpful.
Yeah.
Great to hear, but they often don't feel like they can find it.
Okay. Yeah, that's honestly like the idea of how do we introduce the fact that these other players at the table, they're not. Some of them may be a little bit more inclined to create a detailed backstory. Like they've watched all the podcasts, all the actual play podcasts. They've got this idea in their head, or they are more inclined to dive into the lore, create a story. Oh, I'm a member of this faction. Oh, I'm from this iconic place. All of that stuff can be great for role play, but it isn't necessary. So how do we kind of lower that barrier to entry for players who maybe don't have that same kind of investment in the lore and the world itself in character building? Is that fair? Cool. Okay. Okay. So I've covered, in my slides here, I've covered, some of the basics here, but overall, it sounds like we've got kind of a few common threads here. Number one, and I think the most important here, is to help players recognize when they've had sort of the ball teed up for them to be able to do some role play, to help them identify when there may be some mechanically or as far as a game mechanics perspective, like an advantageous incentive to incentivize them to engage in role play when maybe their primary motivation might be combat or puzzle solving or just the mechanical side of D&D or whatever game you're playing. And to kind of lower that barrier to role play and make it more accessible for people who maybe are intimidated by the idea of putting everything on paper and being locked in, and the idea really that you can improv and you can add small sort of bounded elements to your world and to your backstory in a collaborative manner. Cool. Okay. Well, one thing I want to get through before we kind of talk through some of the more positive aspects of roleplay is just making sure that we avoid some of the more common pitfalls. It can be very difficult for new players and for people who maybe don't have as much experience in a collaborative storytelling environment to engage in roleplay or engage with other players in a way that is not as conducive to role playing, right? This might be some of the more, I think I heard a few mentions of like problematic characters who make it all about them, who,
I do that myself too.
yeah,
I have characters that are very big personalities, so sometimes I have to remember to choke.
yeah. Yeah, how do you avoid that behavior of redirecting the focus to your character in a way that is not kind of passing the ball to the other person, right? So that is honestly like a very common pitfall when I'm seeing players who are at the table. They the idea that they are bringing when someone is talking about an element of the world, they're talking about these creative kind of storytelling elements. Sometimes their focus is more on like bringing themselves into like their motivation is maybe to do something collaborative, to do something engaging with another player, but the way they do that is by kind of just like redirecting the focus to themselves, right? And that can be great because it establishes an intent to collaborate with other players, but it can lead to kind of a storytelling dead end, right? Where now instead of the DM talking about another player's backstory with kobolds, a GM kind of introduces this story thread that's kind of a prompt for someone to latch on to. The GM knows that one of the players has kobolds in their backstory, so they introduce, you see some very crude symbols written in draconic language, right? It looks like there might be kobolds here. That can be a great opportunity for one person to like pick up on that, but if another player at the table kind of makes that about themselves, then that can be kind of a dead end for role play. And again, like some of the other points on here, I'm sure you've probably seen some of these at the table, not matching the tone of the conversation. And especially, this is kind of one that I see very often, but I have trouble nailing down, this third point here. Introducing statements that are hard to build on. I think we all kind of know intuitively what this looks like, and this is kind of the whole reason why I wanted to have this conversation is because it's very easy at the table, especially if you don't have a ton of improv experience, to introduce thoughts and statements which don't invite other players at the table to then share their thoughts and their ideas, right? Instead of a yes and, it's more of like, I don't want to be like kind of too reductive here, but it's like an okay next or like an okay buddy kind of moment. I'm sure we've all had those moments at the table. And it's perfectly common for anyone who's honestly, like I still do this kind of thing where, if you were here during the celebrity match game panel that we did here yesterday, like there are some moments where, maybe some of the jokes didn't land, some of the jokes didn't really flow into what was happening in the panel. It happens. Really what I want to encourage here is for GMs and players to be aware of some of these behaviors and to identify them. And if you feel like you are kind of displaying these behaviors at the table, to enable you to have a conversation with your DM or with your other players to say like, okay, was that disruptive? Like, did you all, was that kind of not like on the mark? If you have that conversation in good faith, then I think that goes a long way towards building that collaborative environment at the table. So I'll stop there. Does anybody have any comments on some of these like more common pitfalls to role playing? Cool. Sure.
Go in more on avoiding statements which are hard to build on.
Yeah.
More examples on that, or
Yeah. Yeah. So this is one of those things that's maybe a little bit easier to understand when you're talking about what does yes and not look like. So if the role play conversation is kind of like a ball that's being passed back and forth between players and the GM, if you are kind of making like a declarative statement that doesn't it doesn't encourage other players to then like add on top of that. That's what I mean by a statement that's hard to build on, right? Like if your response as a player is, okay, I'm not exactly sure how I'm supposed to respond to that. So in this, I give a brief example here. Like, okay, well, there are a lot of red dragons out there. Themberchaud's a red dragon. Themberchaud's a very famous red dragon in the world of D&D, right? I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with that with that information in the course of conversation, right? It may be kind of funny to say like, "Oh wow, I've heard of Themberchaud, the red dragon. Is that the red dragon you're looking for?" Like that then kind of takes a declarative statement and makes it into kind of like me passing the ball back to you. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think it's something that takes a little bit of practice, but as you encourage players sitting at the table to be like, okay, I'm engaging more with what you're saying because I recognize that you're passing the ball back to me. That can lead to a better environment for role play. And if you're the GM kind of focusing on people who are like making these kind of statements, making it kind of more declarative, one tool that I've found really helpful in my experience is to try to append a question onto that, right? In a kind of non-judgmental way, if I were to look at the same example here, you're seeking revenge on a red dragon. Well, Themberchaud's a red dragon, right? If I, as the GM, then take that statement and say, are you asking if Themberchaud specifically is the dragon that they're going after? The idea there is that you're trying to append a question onto that statement, right? And that's one way to handle it. Another is to maybe capitalize on the idea here that we're going to assume that even if someone at the table is making kind of that like declarative statement that it's kind of hard to follow up on, you can assume best intent as the GM and say, okay, well, if you think that there might be one specific red dragon that this person is after based on what you've heard, then you can roll history, right? And maybe you'll get advantage on that history roll if this other player at the table kind of expounds on that a little further, right? So we're going to pass the ball back to the other player to give more information. It doesn't need to nail them down. It doesn't need to be like final, but you're encouraging the players mechanically with a roll to share more and to kind of realize that the goal here is the exchange of information between players that leads to like collaborative storytelling. Does that make sense as like a tool to kind of get around this pitfall? Cool.
If you're another player at the table and that Themberchaud's red dragon, would it help to like go to the original person and be like, oh, like maybe ask more questions and try and help pass the ball back to them?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the most powerful thing in your arsenal as a player and as a GM is curiosity. Right? That is the number one tool for defeating this idea that you are stranded at the table. If you can create an attitude of curiosity and collaborative curiosity at the table, then I think you're golden, right? And I'm going to go ahead and define what I mean here by collaboration and curiosity. Collaborative curiosity kind of has 2 points. Number one, when you're collaborating at the table, you should feel like you're not necessarily nailing down someone or restricting them when they reveal more information about themselves, right? It can be very easy to feel like when you're revealing more of the backstory or when you're collaborating in a creative way to unintentionally kind of like back yourself into what feels like a very closed space where you've only got you are being overly specific about a campaign goal or a whatever the next quest is. And it can be very difficult to feel like you're maybe overstepping your bounds as a player to set the goals that you feel like the GM should be setting. So I think what can be really helpful here is understanding what an open-ended question looks like. An open-ended question is one that does not back anyone into a specific corner. So you might an open-ended question might look like, okay, you're looking for this quest objective, this MacGuffin. Do you know where you might start looking? And that gives the opportunity for a player to say, okay, well, if I'm looking for a diagram, maybe I'm going to look for, workshops, or I'm not nailing down that objective to one specific place. I'm just throwing out kind of general ideas. And that is also kind of a prompt for the GM then to come in and say, all right, this is what the objective is going to be. So if you can avoid asking like very specific questions, like where's the place we're going to look, right? That's a very different question from like, okay, well, what kind of places in general might we be looking for? Does that distinction kind of make sense? Where we're not looking for one specific answer, but we're introducing the idea of like a broader space of answers. As we're role playing, the one way to get around the, I wouldn't say problematic behavior, but very common behavior of making things kind of more about the player. It can be difficult for some players to recognize like, okay, it can be difficult for them to kind of engage in that collaborative space. So one thing that can be helpful for those kind of players who are like more focused on their own characters is to have like a stating something about your character and then passing the ball back moment, right? Where, okay, maybe I'm an Underdark kind of focused character, or maybe I'm not an Underdark focused kind of character. I don't know what a drow is, but based on what you said, they sound fierce. Based on what you said, I'm recognizing that I don't know that much about them. So can you help me like understand more about them? The idea that I'm going to state something about myself and then pass the ball back, I feel like a lot of players maybe don't recognize that second very important step. That can really open the door for collaborative role play. And honestly, like it can be super helpful for characters to, even if they don't necessarily have anything else to contribute to a role play session, to at least say, I don't really have much to add to this conversation, but I'm certainly willing to help you, right? Like I'm willing to, hey, here are my skills that can help on this quest. okay, well, you said something about robbing someone, or you said something about getting an item back. Here are the skills that I have that might be relevant to that. So we're tying back the mechanical skills back to the role play. When you engage like that in role play, you recognize that your goal is to create opportunities for other people to share. So you're not just saying something kind of a closed-ended, you're stating something about yourself, you're asking a curious question, and then you're creating a space for somebody else to share, right? Has anybody ever kind of like experienced something where they feel like they have not been confident in creating at the table because they've been asked maybe like they feel like put on the spot, or they feel like they've been asked something overly specific? Yeah. Yeah, it can be very difficult. The kind of idea to take away there is to recognize when, you know, you should feel like you may not necessarily have the answer either as a player or as a GM, and to give yourself that kind of space to realize when you've been asked to create something, and to be able to come back later with an answer. That's one skill I kind of taking away from some of the thoughts that I heard. The idea that you don't necessarily have to have an answer on the spot, I think, really lowers the boundary for players to create at the table. So if, we as GMs or we as players can introduce the idea that, okay, well, maybe we don't necessarily have to have the answer at the table right now, but we can come back later, or we can kind of workshop what, what the answer is going to look like. Right. So for example, like if I take the first example here, okay, well, I don't know where my player is going to discover this diagram that they're after, but I do know that, we've got, I can maybe introduce this kind of possibility that I was working with a guild that was looking at old workshop sites. And then I can either work with the DM, or, I can work with other players to maybe nail down what that might look like. Other players might contribute their ideas like, oh, well, I've got experience kind of exploring the area. Maybe you've got a ranger in your party and they've got survival skills, right? They can help you survey the area and find that kind of space. So you're not like nailing down anything, but you are creating this space that's going to be filled in over the course of, your sessions. Cool. Yeah.
Something else I thought of is that your character might not necessarily want to just info dump about whatever it is, especially if there's like a time thing. Like if your party's like, oh, tell us every single detail about your guild, and you're like,
Yeah.
I mean, this, and this, but we gotta go do something else.
Right. Right. Yeah. And avoiding the info dump. Right, because you are, when you have to recognize that sometimes when you create on the spot, there's kind of a fudge factor to it, right? Because okay, well, what's the guild? It's the Artificers Guild, right? And you kind of just like first thought, worst thought it, where you want to create something in the moment, but you then kind of look back at this thing that you created in the moment and you're not super satisfied with it. And I think that can be like a kind of a high barrier to just like creating in the moment. What I'm talking about and what I'd like to encourage you all to do is like lower that barrier to creating in the moment by just saying, okay, well, maybe we've got a sketch. We've got a sketch of like a guild, and we can think on that and we can come back to it later. You're in the Discord DMing with your DM between sessions, like trying to hash out some of those details. You don't need to have them in the moment, but you can encourage your players to kind of create that space where you're creating a rough outline and then revisiting that between sessions and over the course of multiple sessions to really fill that out in a more satisfying way. So you don't have to have the like the Sam Riegel like in massive binder of character backstories by the first session of the RPG. Cool. Let me open it up to questions. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions about what we've discussed so far? Sure. Yeah. 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 Yeah, for sure. So how do you create like the nitty-gritty details for the really detail-oriented role players in your group? Yeah, I think one question or one practice that I like to encourage all GMs to get into is anticipating the questions that your group is going to ask. Usually, like if you do have those kinds of players at the table who will ask specifically about local culture, they will ask those all those really detailed questions to try and have some of those answers in your back pocket ready to roll. And the thing is, you don't even necessarily need to have them specific to, if you've got towns 1 through 5 on your in your your campaign, you don't necessarily need to have all those details mapped out for each of those 5 towns. You can either use like you can either just have like one kind of setting in your mind that you're going to pull from, or just use random tables. One thing I like to really encourage people to do is if they are going to have like a location in mind, is to have some kind of reference from fiction or from real life that they're going to draw from. So say, you've got like the south of France. This village is kind of like a village in the south of France or something because you just watched some, pretentious French movie. You've got, maybe you've got an idea in the back of your mind about what that's going to look like, right? And you don't necessarily have all those individual details mapped out, but you've got a starting point, right? Does that help? Cool. Yeah. Um, another another practice I like to encourage DMs to get into is okay, well, what are you interested in? What kind of information are you interested in? I can maybe get back to you later on that. So, in general, I would encourage GMs to kind of like maybe introduce new locations and new ideas towards the end of a session so that, okay, we're going to arrive at this dungeon at the end of a session. And then if there are any things that you're sort of like curious about, then you can get back to me in between sessions and I'll make sure that I've got that prepped. We're getting to a new location at the end of a session. And it's more like a movie or more like an episodic kind of TV show that way where, sometimes people get to new locations at the start of an episode, but a lot of the time, like you'll get to a new location at the end of an episode and you're setting up the next step, right? Cool. Does that help? Cool. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions on kind of like creative? Yeah. Okay. Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
we got a thing to do, and we're like play, and
Okay.
I'm trying to think about how to rephrase that.
Yeah, yeah. So how to maybe curb some of that creative energy from people who are like maybe a little bit too eager to share, sort of in the other end of this spectrum. Yeah. So we'll preface this by saying I don't have any kids, so my do not take any parental advice from me. But no, I have had those kind of situations at the table where people will kind of get overly attached to like an NPC, like the tavern keeper problem, right? Where they kind of glom onto one particular NPC who you literally just made up on the spot. You put no preparation into that character whatsoever. Um, the what I typically do in that situation is start by gently trying to refocus my party and then kind of escalate from there. It's difficult as a GM to know when to kind of wrangle your players because ultimately, like, you want to give them the role playing experience that they want, right? And if maybe everyone at the table is okay with just messing around in the tavern, that's fine. But if one person really wants to interact with like Boblin the Goblin bartender and the other people want to go about the quest, right, then it can be a little difficult to like wrangle them. So what that typically looks like in practice for me is reminding the party of what is at stake. I really, I I have a pretty clear definition of what railroading looks like, and I want to avoid railroading. To me, railroading means that you're making the decision for the party. But railroading does not mean that you're helping the party to understand the consequences of their inaction, right? So instead of saying, all right, this is what you're going to do, and these are the results of your actions because this is what I prepared, you can kind of flip that over and say, all right, these are the results of your inaction. And Boblin the Goblin is probably going to get upset if they're not taking care of the drow incursion into town because suddenly, like, the drow pop out of the sewers and suddenly there's mass chaos, right? And you don't necessarily need to go that far, but I've found that in my experience, a lot of players are responsive to that kind of prompting where, you know, once you've had that understanding that we're here to like tell the story, but we're also here to kind of like do a job and go on a mission. And sometimes storytelling has to take a back seat to getting the thing done. Once you've got buy-in from players and kind of encourage them to, yes, engage in storytelling, but also do the thing that we came here to do, then that kind of like escalation of consequences becomes more of an engaging thing. Like the players choose when the consequences are getting a little out of hand, and then they can go follow on the adventure. Yeah. Does that help? Cool. All right. I think we've covered a lot of the points that I wanted to go over. I think in general, to kind of summarize, it can be difficult to encourage players to hit that balance of contributing and creating ideas without necessarily feeling like we're nailing them down to one specific answer or making them feel like they have to come to the table with everything prepared. As long as we are engaging in role play with curiosity and with this idea that everyone can collaborate ideas, and curiosity looks like a space where there is an exchange. Conversation becomes passing a ball back and forth in a way that allows people to contribute ideas without feeling like they have to be stuck with the idea that, you know, they mention at the table. They're allowed to come back and maybe edit, you know, retcon some of that or come back with more details. Then we're creating a space where people have a motivation to create more and to kind of get more used to creating details about their characters in a collaborative way. We're able to do things like encourage players to provide information and reinforce the players providing that information by rewarding them with advantage on rolls, or rewarding them with other like in-game kind of mechanical benefits that may appeal more to players who don't strictly enjoy role play as much, but they want that mechanical benefit. So that's more the carrot for those players. And you can encourage players to kind of get out of that me mentality by responding to declarative statements that are hard to follow up on with questions, and by rewarding those questions with mechanical benefits or with more world building and more engagement from you as the DM. So I think that's really great. Does anybody have any other sort of like general GM questions? Because we're here for another like 10 minutes. So.
So speaking as a player, and I haven't played as much as the other people in my group, so I'm the quiet one. Something that's helped, we've had a recent new player join, and she's like the epitome of the ambet and
Yeah.
and next, So maybe finding that person who's really receptive to it and nurturing them will help other players, because it's helped me immensely the last couple of weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be great to have a buddy at the table, because if you're the DM, it can maybe kind of create this unintended, like not entirely like antagonistic relationship where you're the only one asking the party for more roleplay details. But if you've got a buddy at the table who is willing to contribute that and is willing to model that behavior, and you kind of like, maybe you don't need to reward that person as much, but you reward the other people at the table for like modeling some of that same behavior, then that helps them incorporate some more of those behaviors.
Yeah, because the original group, bless our charismatic players' soul,
Mm-hmm.
was basically doing all the talking. The rest of us are just like, okay, we're in battle now. All right.
Right.
And now that we have this other person, it's like the whole dynamic shifted. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Any other thoughts? Cool. Is there anything anybody's excited to see at MAGFest for the rest of the weekend? Yeah. Proto Men Part 3, anybody seeing that? Yeah, that's going to be very good. Cool. Well, I will say I'm probably going to go ahead and wrap things up then. If anybody has any questions or anything, feel free to stick around. I'm going to be here for another few minutes. We're also doing the Cost is Correct. I'm part of content productions here at MAGFest. We've been doing content with MAGFest for almost 20 years. How's that back pain for everybody in the audience? So we did a Mario Party today. That was fantastic. If you were there, that was a great environment. Cost is Correct is, I think, in panels 2 tomorrow, so that'll be a great time. I'd like to encourage everyone to have an excellent MAG, to go out and meet people and try new games and new experiences, and I hope you all have a fantastic weekend. Thanks for joining me.